All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the May webinar series from Woodburn Accountants and Advisors, all about employing individuals in China. We are going to look in these next 5 days for newbies and startups to China, what you need to consider when you're employing individuals. Today, we're going to be talking about 9 critical issues, and I've broken up the next 3 days because they will be a little bit more technical into salary compensation, individual income tax, social insurance. And then on the final day, we will be looking at how to actually hire your first hires in China, what you need to consider, how do you find those people, how do you interview those people, and how do you actually then do the contract formulation and what options are available to you. So it's going to be 5 days purely about employing individuals in China and what you need to think about. As I normally do, starting off these sessions, is I'd love to know a little bit the background of those of you that I haven't met yet or communicated yet with. If you would be so kind as typing into the chat box, whether you are a newbie to China, whether you are a startup in China, whether you're an experienced China hand. This always helps me to gauge a little bit about the new folks that are joining our webinar series and gives me a bit of an understanding. So Victoria was saying startup. If anybody else would like to pitch in, John's a startup. Fantastic. So it just basically means if you're a startup that you've already transacted with China, you're just checking out now the next trigger points to see where you're going to be moving forward. From a technical standpoint, I'm here to educate you. So it's going to be very much a material-oriented webinar and webinar series. The recordings of these will be up on our YouTube channel. Today is a public holiday in Europe, so I'm very much doubt I'm going to be getting this webinar up by the end of today. But in theory, all the webinars will be up on YouTube. You'll be able to review them or forward them on to colleagues if you want to have a look. Please use this time wisely. I'm here for the next 90 minutes. Ask your questions. There is no dumb question in China. My first mistake in China was related to employing individuals. So feel free to ask because it is probably one of the key things that foreign investors fail on when they're going into the Chinese market. So please do ask your questions. From a technical standpoint, we're using Zoom meetings. I think today I'm going to have no issues with the Wi-Fi, but if I do, it usually takes 1 minute to 2 minutes for me to reboot and I'll come on and finish the presentation. If that happens to you, apologies. Just know there's the recording. Try to log off, log back in. And if it continues, just know that you'll get the recording and you'll be able to view it later on. All right. But please do ask questions, be interactive. The Q&A is always the fun part because it then just pinpoints exactly the information you're looking for. A little bit about myself. My name's Christina Kohler-Colucci. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. My focus for the last 17 years and ultimately my entire career has been about inbound investment into China and helping foreign investors with their inbound entry. We are our corporate services firm, so I've dealt with all types of administration issues, employment issues, compliance issues related to the entities of our clients in China as well as in Hong Kong. I have created targeted methodologies for companies to ease their entry into the market as well as their operation all the way through the China roadmap, saving your brand in China, incorporation blueprint, how to grow your business with your Chinese accountant, how to choose the right people for your corporate management, and how to recruit and employ your first employees in China. All of these webinars are on demand, not all, almost all are on demand on our website. If you're interested to go check them out, please do. Also know I have launched a book on Amazon called 9 Superpowers to Succeed in China. If you are all interested in getting a copy of that, just type into Amazon 9 Superpowers to Succeed in China, and you can get it on Kindle as well as in a hard copy format. It's just tips and tools of the trade in relation to doing business in China. So to start off with today's presentation, we're going to look at the critical Chinese labor and employment law questions that get asked especially in the entry phase into China, okay? You might have a whole series of other questions you want answered, so please do put them into the chat box so we can touch upon them. And I hope that with these questions, I'll be able to give you an overview of what's happening. I wanted to start off today's presentation though on what are the current situations at the moment in China. I'm going to give you a personal reflection, an employee perspective, and then a business reflection, all related to COVID, okay? Because COVID has been special. There are still many people that are blocked out of China. And the questions I generally get asked is, how do I continue my operations in China if I can't be on the ground in China? So I want to start off with this personal, employee, and business reflection, and then I'll go on to the nine critical issues. Okay, so what is the current situation in China at the moment? All right, why, especially now, why should we be concerned by the labor issues? Okay, well, number one is it's very difficult for most of us to be able to travel. All right, I have a residence visa in China, and I still don't have the ability to go back. Okay, so I'm not the only person in this situation. There are thousands of people that are in similar situations as I am in that can't physically get on the ground. And what we know about the Chinese market is that fraud does exist. If you can't travel over there, it's sometimes difficult to control the situation. You generally have very high expectations about the Chinese market, but it is a new business culture, and sometimes, you know, things get out of hand that you didn't expect to get out of hand, or things happen that you weren't aware could happen in the Chinese market, all right? And then obviously, because you're physically not on the ground, you might have misplaced trust and loyalty from your employees. So this is why you should be worried, okay? Now, all of these reasons are not just because it's China. I mean, these things would happen if I were to set up an entity in Brazil, if I were to set up an entity in India. None of this is new or generally specific to just China, okay? Fraud exists everywhere. And so I want to highlight that from the beginning, because it's not just, oh, it only happens in China. No, it happens globally. It's just, how can you control the organization and the running of your company? So fraud happened to me very early on in my journey. It happened within the first 7 months of being operational in the Chinese market. And I just would like to highlight, it happened while I was there on the ground, and it happened in front of me, okay? And I was completely unaware that it was actually occurring. So I also want people to realize that fraud will probably exist and happen at some point in your China journey. What I want to try and do is to provide you with the tips and tools of the trade, so to speak, on how to limit that and how to become aware of the warning signs if it is happening, okay? I would have said normally at this point, pinpointing those warning signs so that you get up on a plane and you travel over so you can mitigate that risk. Unfortunately, we can't just hop on a plane and travel over to mitigate that, but there are ways where we can involve outsourced providers who can then help you, okay? So here's a personal reflection on what is happening right now, and I'm just gonna base it on my current situation. I have an entity in Shanghai. I have a team of people that are on the ground in Shanghai. I left in February 2020 because of COVID, and from a family perspective, just not knowing what was going to happen, were we going to be able to be near family, very typical expatriate issues. Since February 2020, we have not been able to go back to China. And our current decision has actually been to stay another school year in Europe, because we've got kids and we have to make a decision on the schools. So we've decided to stay another year. The issue for us is that we are in Luxembourg. Luxembourg doesn't offer a Chinese vaccination system, so we cannot apply or update our current residence visas because we cannot obtain the Chinese vaccination. In addition to that, we cannot show proof that it's an emergency for us to return. On a separate note, from a family perspective, we are relieved we cannot go back because we do have relatives that are ill, and we do need to be on the ground to be closer to them. You've got to make the assumption that for a lot of expatriates who have families, this is going to be an obstacle currently, in order to get visas, in order to be able to have re-entry into the country. I have a lot of friends whose families are separated, where one spouse is in China and the rest of the family is in Europe for similar reasons as I, where relatives are sick or they have to be close by just in case. So this is a prevention. Now, I'm saying this from a perspective of having a residence visa. There are a lot of people who would just simply like to travel to China for business reasons. Again, you need to go through a process through your Chinese embassy in the country that you are located in to understand what the requirements are and criteria are for you to be able to go into China. As of last week, quarantine regulations in Shanghai have gone up, whereas previously it was just simply 2 weeks of quarantine in a designated facility. It is now 2 weeks of quarantine in a designated facility plus 1 week in your home, whether that's going to be in a hotel or whether that's in your actual residence. So it's gone up to 3 weeks. If you travel to Hong Kong, it is 21 days in a hotel of quarantine. So you have to take this into consideration. The regulations are continuously changing. So do not make the assumption that I know every Chinese embassy's regulation. It is impossible to know that. Go to the Chinese embassy's website in your home jurisdiction, go to the UK one, the German one, wherever, and you will find the step-by-step guideline as to what you have to do if you're looking to go into China. Do not collect documents or start vaccinations until you are fully clear and transparent about the procedures. I have had expats who are looking to relocate to China who have started with one type of vaccination and have now had to switch and have had to get authorizations from GPs to get all of this done. Please consult with the Chinese embassy directly, either by a face-to-face visit or a phone call to know exactly how this is supposed to work, okay? There is no unified system. And as far as I'm aware, most of you that are on here are, I think, from the UK, because in the UK, it's not a public holiday today, but it can also depend on the passport you're holding. So not just because you're based in the UK, but it's also the passport you're holding that you might have different rules. So please do have that conversation directly with the embassies in relation to that, okay? If you are in mainland Europe, you might have a bit of flexibility. If, for example, I haven't actually researched this, but if Germany were to provide the Chinese vaccination, I could potentially go there and do it. The question then just becomes a personal issue. Do you want to have the Chinese vaccination? Okay. Now, from an employee side of things, in China right now, they are promoting and advertising tremendously to employees, not just to employees, but to citizens to take the vaccination. One of my staff members openly told me that she is not ready to take the vaccination because in China, there is no need to. You are walking around free. Everything is fully open. My team, friends, are not walking in the streets with masks on. They are walking like normal human beings. The only places where masks are utilized are obviously in hospitals, train stations, airports, government facilitated areas, public transportation facilities, people wear them in the metro. But other than that, nobody's wearing them in meetings, in offices, nothing. It's all fully open, okay? So I want people to realize that China is domestically got its doors fully open. So the feeling of my team is some have taken it, others haven't, but those that haven't, their philosophy is, why bother to take it? We can't do international travel anyhow. And when we do international travel, we are told that certain countries require certain vaccinations, and it just gets more and more complicated, so we're waiting. So many haven't. Another aspect is that because life is normal, they're going about their day-to-day business normally. Things are functioning. There are no restrictions in terms of meetings and whatnot. Now, the only issue comes down to when you have inter-province travel. So for example, my team's based in Shanghai. If they were now to do client site visits in Hangzhou or in Suzhou or Nanjing, or traveling to Wuxi, Xi'an, Xiamen, other areas, Zhejiang, Jiangsu province, or even going up to Beijing, they do have to check quarantine requirements. And that becomes very complicated because it's city specific, where you're coming from and where you're going to in terms of that city, which districts are you going to be entering into, etc. We have had situations where we have had to stop certain activities, like for example, doing inventory stock checks, because where the factory was located was a case where coronavirus was peaking, and the team just didn't want to do quarantine. So inter-China, you do have to check this. You do have to check what the quarantine measures are and whether it's actually really free travel. In the majority of places it is. And in the media, you don't really hear that, but it is something that you should technically think about. But from an employee perspective, of those that are in China, everything is as normal. From a business reflection, what is the current situation? Well, in my organization, the current situation is that I'm not on the ground. Other than that, my team are on the ground and they are fulfilling all of the service delivery. I have created organizational structures that I am speaking to my team daily. We have team meetings, we have one-to-one meetings throughout the week so that I know what is happening on the ground. And we have made the best out of the worst. In actual fact, what we've discovered is that I sleep longer hours when I'm in Europe because all the decision makers that I'm speaking with are in Europe and in the US and in Canada. So from a time zone perspective, my life is a little bit easier. In other people's situations, and I reflect this now on my clients that have operations in China, the bigger the operation, the more complicated it is. Predominantly because you will have various departments that you need to control and coordinate with, whether that is production, whether that is sales, whether that is from a sourcing perspective, simply the administrative functions in terms of finance, HR. And obviously in many instances, because of cultural barriers and language barriers, it sometimes is easier to do things face-to-face than it is over Zoom or other video conferencing tools and whatnot. In the end of the day, we are all in this situation together. You're not the only company that is stuck, okay? We have to make the best out of the situation. We're a year and a half into this. And if you haven't set up systematic processes to follow up with your team and know what is going on the ground in order to be transparent, then you need to fix that ASAP. That's the only thing I'm going to say. And if you have a feeling that something is going wrong with either a team member or with your organization as a whole, there are outsourced providers in the form of lawyers, accountants, depends what's going on, who can come in and investigate what is going on, either through audits, internal health checks, whatever it might be, and you can make those as specific as you like, okay? So you do have outsourced individuals that can help to go in and actually look at your organization from the inside out to view what could be possibly going wrong, if anything, all right? So people need to be aware that they have this possibility of going in, okay? Don't leave things lingering in China. And that always leads to issues. Now, what are the current challenges for companies in China? Well, for me, I'm seeing four current challenges. The one is a staff shortage because China is open, it's functioning, and companies are growing. And what we have noticed is that our clients are going through a recruitment or headhunting peak to find individuals. Now, the issue with finding individuals at the moment is that you are getting a poor litter of candidates. Those companies in 2020 that had to downsize were downsizing obviously in the individuals that were not on the top of their lists. So it was basically, you know, the ones at the bottom end that they were letting go. So when you look at the pool of labor, particularly in a city like Shanghai, the quality of labor available right now is not the best. If you are then poaching individuals that are still working for organizations, the conversations that you're going to have are, what guarantee can you give me that I'm not going to be let go during the probation period because I need job security? That's the main conversation I've been having when I've been going through my recruitments for finance individuals is, you know, you're telling me I have to go through a probation period of, I don't know, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. That's risky for me. I need to have job security. So because of this, they don't want to leave their current posts, even if they're not happy. They want to stay there. They need that security. And as a result, they won't switch. If you are lucky enough to find employees that are still working in organizations, but those organizations are slowly going downhill, then you're poaching them at the right moment in time, because they know they have to leave. The company is going down. It could be that they will downsize in any case, and they might then switch for that reason. Okay. So staff shortage is an issue. Finding the right individuals that would fit in your organization is also an issue. Recruitment projects are longer, particularly I see it more in the administrative side of things. So you do need to be aware of that. There are challenges in regards to materials and production and logistics. I'm going to talk about those two things together because of general supply chain issues globally. So this is a big issue that's occurring just generally, and I think it's happening anywhere and everywhere in the world. And the last is liability. Being that China is generally the subsidiary of foreign investors, there is currently this question mark in people's mind. Will this company survive? Will it continue in China? Where is it moving? Is it moving forward? We know that China's open. We know that people want to invest, but is there really this commitment to the market? So there is this question mark in people's minds as well in regards to the liability and the direction that people and companies are moving into. Safety measures and practical solutions. This was obviously implemented already in 2020. And what's actually really interesting is that these safety measures and practical solutions have actually continued. So although people can go to the offices, something that we've done is we've downsized our office space, where we have only 2 or 3 employees who are physically in the office and that are on a rotation system, and the rest are either on site at clients' offices or working from home. It's helped us a lot in terms of our budgeting, cutting down costs, and actually surprisingly, making the team really happy that they have this flexibility to work from home a few days, work from the office a few days, and anyway working on site at clients' offices. In terms of crisis team, we're small, so that's my job. I have a function where if people are in need to speak, they have this ability now. We developed it in 2020 more seriously. I never really had it before, but we are pushing for this more. And I see that my clients as well are pushing for this as well. I've named it diplomatically crisis team, but we can also call it a whistleblowing function where team members have the ability to discuss. In large organizations, there's a hotline for employees. Anytime you go into an office building, you have to do the daily health status query, the same if you go into factories. And then just generally self-quarantine. So if I do have team members that are traveling on site to clients or traveling just generally to companies' locations, we do have an internal self-quarantine regulation of 3 days where they don't go into the office or see anybody. So these are all internal policies that have been developed in 2020, but it's something that has remained and has functioned extremely, extremely well. So this is, again, you know, you're starting up in China, you're probably not going to start up with a team of people. If you are, it might just be 2 to 3. That's a lot easier to manage than if you're a team of 20, 40, 50, 60 people, 100 people, 150 people. But implementing these safety measures is still crucial because although you don't really read it in the media, there are sometimes peaks of the virus that do occur, and you just need to be aware of it. Something that unfortunately did not happen last year with many clients because they just were lost and didn't know what to do, and then there were excuses of time zone and it's China, is establishing healthy levels of communication with with employees, suppliers, customers, and any other third parties. Somehow communication ended and was terminated for a certain period of time where I became a middleman for many employees of my clients who just didn't know what was going on. Communication with WeChat nowadays, I hope you all have WeChat, is vital. Maintaining those relationships and that level of communication is critical. I talk to my team daily, okay? Because I want transparency, but it's also to have that connection with them. If you have established a Chinese entity or you have people on the ground, you have to have communication policies that are set up. And it shouldn't just rely with one person in your organization. It should be a team of people that are communicating with those on the ground. And even in 2021, again, something that became more noticeable, was happening more in 2020, is just reviewing your financials and your financial modeling continuously. It's an activity that we do with our clients on a monthly basis to know where we are at. I always say there are 2 key costs in a startup in China. One is rent and the other is salaries. You have to be able to review those against your revenues and make sure that you are floating and able to maintain a cash flow positive status in your organization. So these are just a couple of safety measures and practical solutions that we've developed internally, something I want to share with people so they are aware that this has to happen still in COVID times. Again, I'm a big believer in this. China is the country that is growing at the moment. And if I look at my clients, if I look at our business, suddenly in 2021, we are peaking and it's only May. Your team on the ground in China are going to be vital for your business. Maintain those relationships. That should be a priority. Respect the partnerships that you are developing on the ground. Because for some reason in 2022, those partnerships went down the hill because people lost all forms of communication and just did not know how to communicate. Okay. There was a shock when I was telling clients, have you sent a Chinese New Year message on your WeChat to all your contacts? Something like that is so simple to do. You can do broadcast messages on WeChat. I don't know if you're aware of that, where you can have one message, you send it to your entire contact list, and that's just a way of maintaining relationships, whether it's with your employees, again, suppliers, whomever that's in your WeChat account, okay? So please, please, please remember the importance of communication. So I'm going to move on to the 9 critical issues in the Chinese labor and employment law. And I formatted them into 9 questions, which are generally the 9 questions that I get asked about how to operate individuals in China. So the first one is, can you hire in China without a legal presence? And somebody, I forget who it was, I don't know if you're on here today, asked this question in the registration form. So the simple answer is no, you cannot hire individuals in China without a legal presence. Freelance agreements are an extremely gray area in China. meaning that there is no formal legislation about freelance agreements. It's a very gray area. There's no black and white answer to those types of agreements. So what happens? Normally, when companies are interested in the Chinese market, what they do is they find somebody that they can hire to lead their project and see if there is momentum, to see if there is actual business available on the ground, somebody who really does the market research for you, okay? What they do is they find this person, they communicate via email. Most of that communication is done via email. Terms and conditions of that employment is done via email, and there's no formal contract that is ever signed. Not even, in many cases, a formal freelance agreement, okay? Now, many times nothing happens. It's a great relationship, whatever. But I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but the person that you're hiring on the other side in mainland China, even with freelance agreements, should be declaring social insurance and income tax. In 99.9% of the cases, they never do. And in that moment where that relationship can go sour, who do you think that individual is going to blame? They're going to blame you, okay? And they might take that case to the Labor Arbitration Committee and vocalize your company, the headquarter, because that's how the relationship initiated, to say they haven't hired me properly, okay? So that's not a nice way to start your business in China. In fact, it's a terrible way to start your business in China. The first person you've hired is actually now causing trouble for you, okay? So when you have people who are residing in China, and I say there are two categories, you've got the foreigners and you've got the mainland Chinese individuals. When you have these individuals physically residing in China, they need to be employed by an entity in China, okay? If they're going to be receiving any form of a salary. Otherwise, these individuals need to set up their own companies in order to be able to receive that income, okay? So either they're employed by an entity in China, or they themselves have to set up their own entity, or they need to be hired by an intermediary, okay? But these freelance agreements concepts, you are going into a gray area where you are not protected. And just to note, even if that relationship goes so smoothly in the first 5, 6, 7 years, you've incorporated your entity, you've transferred this person into that entity, you think that everything is hunky-dory, yeah? And then eventually, 10 years later, you want to actually fire that person or whatever the case might be, they still have leverage over you because you spent a certain period of time not hiring them properly. And they know that. And that's leverage for them over you. That's a negotiation tactic that they can use when terminating. And they can say, well, you know, I wasn't hired properly in the first 2 years of employment with you. I want you to pay me the social insurance and income tax I'm owed from those two years that I was hired. They're always going to try and get money. And they're always going to try and get excuses. But guys, hey, listen, if you've been terminated, you would go through that negotiation yourself. If you had leverage over the company, you would use it. We just need to figure out what's the best way of protecting ourselves, okay? You don't want your employees to have more leverage over you than you have over them. And you want it to be a fair playing field, okay? So please know that anybody that is residing in China, either they have to set up their own entities, they need to be hired by an entity that's registered in mainland China, or hired by an intermediary that is registered in mainland China. Okay, but you can't just hire them directly from your home jurisdiction. You can't have these freelance agreements. It's legally a dangerous thing to do because you have this person having leverage over you for over a certain period of time. All right. And I will touch on using intermediaries at the end of today's presentation, just so you're all aware of it, because there are a lot of people who don't know that they have this option available. The second is a written employment contract required, and is an electronic version of that contract permissible? Okay, so is a written employment contract required? Absolutely. This is the #1 document that you have to have. Now, what was the mistake that I made in my first 7 months in China? Is I used an employment contract template from my home jurisdiction, which at that time was our head office is and still is in Hong Kong. We used that contract and we used all the clauses and terminology for that. And all we did was change the last clause in that contract to state that the jurisdiction of enforcement was the People's Republic of China instead of Hong Kong. Our assumption was, oh, well, Hong Kong is part of China, so all the rules and regulations are the same. And I still, in today's world, do get I get direct statements from individuals saying, oh, Christina, to save cost, I'm just going to use the UK template. Can you just review it and check it and let me know if it's okay? My feedback to that is I can review it and check it, but I will have to change the entire agreement to fit Chinese labor law. Okay, so please remember that you've got to spend that little bit of money to be able to get labor contracts that are according to PRC regulations, so that again, you have leverage and you know what is going on in those contracts. You know how to manage that staff member, and you know what the termination regulations are. And many of you might assume that this is all common sense. It still happens today. I got this question last week, okay, that they wanted to use their UK contracts. In terms of electronic versions, now this is a question that I get not just for employment contracts, but I get it generally for contracts. If by law, electronic versions are absolutely fine, you can use electronic signatures. Legally, it's okay. When you go into enforcement though, the government wants to see hard copies because they want to see the original chops, they want to see the original signatures. So my philosophy is still very much old school. Even internally, we do it the old-fashioned way. Everything is an original signatures, original chops. We don't do anything with electronic versions. That is something that's then up to you to decide how you want to create your system processes. I just don't want to have to deal with then backtracking and getting those if there is a case where we have to go to court. So I just systematically do it with original versions. Question number 3, how difficult is it to terminate an employee in China? Quite frankly, it's extremely difficult. The labor law protects employees. They do not protect companies, okay? If you have the ability to create a mutual termination agreement, that will make life a lot easier. But let's face it, when you're terminating someone, it's very rarely mutual. So what are you going to do, right? My suggestion is the following, because labor laws change and your circumstance when you're terminating someone will be very different from one employee to another. And this was, again, a mistake that I made and made over and over until I finally realized. Always check with a labor lawyer before you terminate someone. Explain the situation. The feedback from the lawyer will always be, what evidence do you have that that employee has done X, Y, and Z? Okay? You need to have evidentiary proof. So if you have in your mindset that you are looking to terminate somebody, make sure you gather evidence of their misbehavior, or misbehavior is a bit difficult to obtain evidence for, but if they have done something wrong and you can get it through emails, or you've got to highlight certain things, which will lead me to the employee handbooks and their relevance and their importance on this. but you need to accumulate evidentiary proof as to why you want to terminate somebody. And you should discuss that with the lawyer. What do you have on hand? And honestly, if you also tell the lawyer, I've got nothing on hand, I don't have any evidentiary proof, quite honestly, I'm terminating this person because of behavior. They've done X, Y, and Z. Then even with behavior, the lawyer will come back and say, well, have you issued warning letters on their behavior? Because the warning letter is a sign of proof that you have already discussed with them an action plan that, you know, they've got to fix themselves up. So you have to show this proof. And again, every circumstance is a little bit different. Something that I've learned is when I'm trying to terminate senior managers, I will always ask the lawyer to come with me because of a cultural aspect. The Chinese tend to lose face, and you never know how they're going to react. In many instances, it's been volatile, where police have been called in, where I've had one client of mine hid in his office and locked the door. I've had a case where a client's staff member grabbed scissors and started walking around the office threatening. So there are situations, more often than not, where the staff member loses face and police have to be called in because they get very volatile. Okay, so when you are letting go of senior managers who might be holding critical documents, business licenses, chops, bring a lawyer in that can support you, because they are the ones that are going to be doing the negotiation and the discussions. They will know when is the right time to call the police if needed. They will have the clear-minded aspects of doing these types of negotiations. Now, this all might scare you. It might be like, oh my God, we have to think about these things. But listen, now that I've learned this, bringing in a lawyer for me is the norm. I bring in a lawyer. You prep for all of this. So I have a one-to-one meeting with the lawyer. I explain the situation. I explain what evidence I've had. I've explained the back and forth communication. Things haven't improved. We've got to terminate. What are my options? What is the strategy we should take for that termination? Getting a lawyer on board might become a lot cheaper for you than the compensation that the person on the other side of the table might ask from you. Okay? Especially if you are a newbie or a startup in China and you're hiring that first individual, make sure you are getting advice before you terminate. You don't want to get into a situation where you have to get lawyers, you have to go to court, you don't sleep at night, etc. Okay? What it did to me was it prevented me from focusing on the business because I was so caught up in this administrative aspect. So all I can say is on this, it is difficult to terminate people. It's not easy because the labor law is geared more towards employees than companies. Make sure separately you get an employee handbook, which I believe is the next point in this, and consult with a lawyer, with a labor lawyer who can actually maybe even attend that meeting. And this is something for those of you that can't physically travel to China. If you already have employees in China that you're looking to let go, don't forget you can hire a lawyer to do that activity for you and that exercise for you. Okay? You're not alone in this. The employee handbooks will probably be the next question. But the next question is a fixed term employment contract permissible? So in China, the regulation is as follows. You can start off an employment relationship with a fixed term employment contract or with an open-ended agreement. Fixed term can be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, completely up to you. However, the law is as follows. You can only have 2 fixed term contracts with an employee, and in the third one, it has to be open-ended. Okay? Now, my belief is to just start with an open-ended agreement because in the end of the day, the termination clauses and the compensation that is owed upon termination is the same whether you finish a fixed term agreement or whether you have an open-ended agreement. The reason why people choose fixed term employment contracts, I believe, is more from a psychological perspective that you are not sure whether this is going to be a long-term employee. You don't know if trust can be built. You don't know if loyalty can be built. So you might want to keep this employee on their toes by signing first a 1-year fixed term, seeing how that 1 year goes. If you do that, then the regulation with fixed term contracts, the probation period matches the term of the agreement. So if you sign a 1-year agreement, the probation is 1 month. If you sign a 2-year fixed term agreement, it's two months. Okay, it matches that term. Rarely will people sign a 5-year employment contract. It's usually either 1, 2, or 3 years. And they do that again because they are not sure whether the term is going to be, whether this person will be permanent or not. My philosophy is just sign an open-ended contract, and I don't have to think about contracts again. My issue with fixed term agreements is that people forget that they've put employees on fixed terms, and then they forget to do the renewal, so that when the 2nd year starts, there is no employment contract, which means that the employee has leverage over you in terms of penalties because there's no written agreement. So if you do fixed term agreements, make sure you remember, make sure you have in your calendar a notice of when that renewal has to occur and how you're going to negotiate those terms and conditions. And the penalty befalls the employer. So it could also be a tactic from the employee not to say anything to you in terms of renewal because they want the penalty to be paid to them. Okay, so be aware of that. Is an employee handbook required? So technically, legally, employee handbooks are not required. But from my opinion, it's strongly recommended. Okay, the employee handbook not only lists your internal policies about leave, about allowances, but it also is the tool to be able to terminate employees. And the feedback that I get from most startups in China is we don't have the budget. We have the budget to pay for an employment contract template, but we don't have the budget to pay for an employee handbook template. And by the way, Christina, we're so small. I mean, 1 employee, I can manage that. That's not an issue. Please don't forget that in China, teams grow relatively quickly from 1, not just from 1 to 2 to 3, but sometimes from 1 to 5 to 10. And you still don't have an employee handbook because you've forgotten about it. Okay? When you have an employee handbook, it is a tool of system processes on how to manage your employees. And I'm a big believer in system processes because it allows you to focus more on the business once your system processes are in place and you and your employees know that there's a document available to look at when you want to know about maternity leave, when a staff member's family has died and you know what the bereavement period is. It's a tool that you can reflect back on in cases like that versus contacting labor lawyers and trying to understand what the legislation is and paying for that. It's just in that employee handbook always. But in addition to that, in ours, the last section is all about warning letters and breach of contract, meaning that if your staff member has done something wrong, they've misbehaved, I don't know, there's so many reasons that something could go wrong. They didn't follow the system process for sales or whatever, and you want to send them a warning letter that's written in the employee handbook. It's not then a surprise to anybody if they receive a warning letter. And you can have the rule saying 3 warning letters and you're automatically terminated. Okay, or 4 warning letters, whatever you want to do as your internal policy. Okay, and there are levels of breach. You have level A, which might be minor misdemeanors. You might have level B, where it gets a little bit serious. Level C, so serious that if they do that, they automatically get terminated. A well-written employee handbook can guide you so much into not having to deal with the discussions with employees or them losing face, because it's there, it's in that system process book. All right, so if you are getting into the Chinese market and your goal is only to start off with 1 employee, Do it already with that one employee. Use them as the guinea pig on how to manage that employee handbook. All right. And once you hit the second, third, fourth employees, it's there. And that first employee can actually guide. All right. And understand the internal policies and rules and regulations and whatnot. Okay. Inside there are also things about business trips, expenditure, allowances, how much is a meal when I'm traveling, you know, how much can I pay for hotels, whatever it might be. It's all inside there. Okay. So please seriously think about adding that into your budget and making sure you have that document with the employment contract together from your first employee. Does Chinese employment law differ from province to province? Yes. Yes. And this is where it gets, and they're also, it's not just the employment law, but there are also nuances with internal policies that you have to adjust by because of the way the living standard is in different provinces. So let me backtrack this question a little bit. Because I don't know if you're aware of that, but my entity is registered in Shanghai. I have the majority of my team residing in Shanghai, and then they're employed by my Shanghai company. I also have employees that are residing in other cities where I have not established a branch office because I just have one additional employee in that city and it doesn't warrant me setting up a branch, which means that that employee is hired by my Shanghai company based on Chinese labor laws, signs my employee handbook, which I have to adapt based on where they're residing. Okay, so you do need to be aware of the local nuances if you start hiring people in other cities, because it will be different from Shanghai. For example, a very basic one, taking a client out for lunch in Shanghai, my team has to spend more money because of the standard of living than if we take a client out in Xi'an. So the budget that the Xi'an employee has is going to be much lower than the one that's in Shanghai. These are just the tiny nuances that you have to adapt in your employee handbook. All right. Now, in terms of legislative laws, there are, again, going to be nuances. There are also different ways the courts manage things if you are in Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Chengdu, Chongqing, Beijing, Shanghai, etc. And you need to be aware of, I've written it here, so I'm just going to say it out loud, what the interpretations are in those cities of those employment laws. Again, unfortunately, China legislation is not black and white. There's always room for interpretations, and there's always going to be room for interpretations in different cities because of how life is there, okay? It's the same in Germany. Life in Munich is very different than life in Frankfurt or Hamburg, and there are always going to be nuances in terms of employing people, how to manage that. So you need to be aware of this. So if you are establishing your business in Guangzhou, you've got to understand what the Guangzhou nuances are for employing individuals. Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, etc. Ultimately, the employment contract will not state that you are signing it based on Shanghai law. No, the law is Chinese law, China law. The place of arbitration might not be Shanghai, it might be Guangzhou where you are establishing your business. Okay. How do employment matters impact transactions? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here by what I mean in terms of transactions. In China, if you have started up your operation using a representative office and you've hired your people with this representative office and now you want to change that, you need to realize that you have to first establish a limited company and then close down the rep office. Once that limited company is established, the employees are transferred over. What does that mean? It's not just a transfer. It means they have to sign brand new employment contracts. So what we do in situations like this is we recommend that one of the first clauses will be that the company, or sorry, that the employee has maintained a relationship with the shareholder for X period of years, to show the long-standing relationship of that employee with your organization. You will find that employees want to have that clause inside because it also dictates in their resumes that they've been with your company for a series of years, not just because they've changed the actual structure, okay? If you use a PEO service, PEO stands for, I'll use another term, employer of record service. So for example, you use an intermediary initially that's registered in China to hire the employees that you want. Eventually you realize you want to establish your own company in China. Those employees need to be transferred over. Again, they need to resign from that employer of record, and they will then transfer over to that new entity. Again, it is our recommendation to always add that clause. I've been in the relationship of this employer for X number of years to show the long-standing relationship, again, with the Labor Bureau as well. So it's not really a transfer. It's actually, you're resigning formally and you're signing new employment contracts. The issue with this, and that's the question, how do employment matters impact transactions? What we have seen, doesn't happen all the time, it really will come down to the character of the employee, is that they will use that opportunity to renegotiate the terms of the contract. So if you're using an employer of record and the person is now earning 25,000 RMB, they will say, oh, I have to sign a new contract and I have to sign that new contract with your own company. I'd like to renegotiate my salary now. I'd like to get 35,000. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, guys, but they will use that opportunity to negotiate the terms and conditions. So you need to be aware of that. And you need to have that discussion prior with your lawyer saying, what are my rights? What do I do in terms of negotiation? What areas do I have to look at if they start negotiating? Where do I have leverage where I say you're joking? Where do I have other areas where I'll say, okay, I'll give you an increase of XYZ, but then in 2 years, you don't get another increase for 2 years, so whatever it might be. But make sure you have that leverage and you're prepared for those discussions. Not that suddenly you're sitting there expecting the guy to just sign off on the new contract and he doesn't say anything and he just does it, right? Expect that discussion. Number 8 is in relation to trade unions. All right, is a non-unionized foreign company affected by local labor unions? Yes, they are. I'm saying yes, they are because they are, but does it really impact you on a day-to-day business? No. I have never, a labor union can be formed in China with your organization if you've got 25 or more employees. I've never ever been impacted by local labor unions, nor have I been impacted by trade unions. I've never been asked by my team that they want to create a labor union. It will really depend on where you're establishing your business. It will also come down to the industry and sector that you are in, particularly if you've got blue collar workers. So, although labor unions don't come into play generally for small, medium-sized companies, I want people to be aware that it can happen, particularly depending on where you are establishing your organization and depending on the type of employees you're going to be hiring. Because it's the employees that can initiate that discussion of wanting to formulate a labor union or saying that the local state union has said X, Y, and Z, and we need to now apply that, okay? I've seen it happen. It hasn't physically happened to my organization. We've never been in that. It could be because we're in the professional sector, professional service sector versus actually in the production sector. But again, something critical that I want people to be aware about, because also when you set up your company, there will be a chapter on trade unions. And when you have your employment contracts, there will be a couple of clauses in there regarding trade unions as well. And the last critical question is, are there other hiring alternatives besides direct employment? Yes. So from our perspective, besides direct employment, you've got options which are labor dispatch, part-time, independent contractors, and employer of record service. So labor dispatch companies are local companies that were created initially in China in order to be able to hire people that were hired by foreign investors. Foreign investors could never sign direct employment contracts. Over the last 17 years, that's changed, where now you can sign direct employment contracts if you have a limited liability company. But if you are a rep office, you cannot. You have to go through a labor dispatch agent. Labor dispatch agents are also utilized if you are wanting to hire people part-time. So you can use labor dispatch. I've put that item there to know that that's the entity that hires individuals for representative offices. You would still need to use that type of agent if you're going through part-time, okay? Meaning if you're gonna hire an accountant who works for you part-time, they would be hired through this labor dispatch and the salary goes through that labor dispatch agent, okay? Independent contractors are just random companies, suppliers, this happens a lot with suppliers, customers, distributors, where you utilize their entities to hire individuals. So this happens a lot in China. One case that comes up in my mind right now is actually where a distributor hired an expat and hired 2 locals from the client to be based in their office. And what happens basically is that the distributor either knocks that off of their commission, their fee in terms of the salaries and whatnot, or they invoice the overseas company for salaries and potentially a commission, a small fee, service fee for that. Employer of record service is actually an HR company that has the ability to hire individuals on your behalf who work in China. I call it the employer of record service because it's just easier for people to understand that concept. The labor dispatch, they've now changed their rules that they will only offer these services if you actually have an entity on the ground in China. So rep office, or if you have a limited company to hire the part-time. They will not contract with you if it's just through your overseas entity. The employer of record, the PEOs, they will contract with your overseas company, and the independent contractors as well, okay? People are not aware of this employer of record service. I want that to become more well-known, that there is this option available for you, okay? So I just want to finish off today's presentation of explaining what the employer of record service is and what does it actually mean. So if you are like I said earlier, if you're hiring mainland Chinese employees or foreign employees, they have to be, and they're residing in China, they have to be employed by an entity in China. For foreign employees, it's extremely strict because they need to get sponsored by the company to get the work permit and residence visa, okay? And you have the option, if you don't want to set up your entity yet, to hire individuals through an employer of record service. So who would use an employer of record service? It would be companies that are looking to test the market, they're looking to do market research, and they want somebody on the ground. It's companies who are overseas contractors and they need to do some type of technical service or implementation in China, but it's not permanent and they need to use an intermediary to do that. Companies that are in the midst of deciding to have an entity in China, but have found people and don't want to lose those individuals, they will use an employer of record service to keep those individuals while they're in that decision-making phase, as well as the incorporation phase of the companies to do that hiring. And those that are basically looking to evaluate the market, and they're realizing they want to hire people to evaluate the market versus outsourcing that to companies. And so they hire individuals to do that. So normally the people that we're hiring for this service would be business development folks, salespeople, and technical staff. Disadvantages of using an employer of record service. Now, this is so important. I want people to know what this is. Using employer of record services is not something that should be permanent. It is an intermediary solution for you to be able to hire people legally in China, but it is not a permanent solution. The disadvantages that it can bring is that the employee has no sense of belonging. They do not know what your goal and your strategy is for the Chinese market. They're hired by an intermediary. They don't feel like they are fully hired by you and that you're taking this market seriously. Okay? The other thing is that it might not be easy to hire employees. Oh, hold on. And it might not be easy to hire employees because some employees are not willing to join under this methodology. They don't feel like they are secure and stable. And many of them do not understand the concept of the employer of record service. So many of them might refuse the job because of this. All right. The employment contract has to follow the HR service provider's contract. Okay, you cannot just create one according to your terms and conditions. The employee handbook also has to follow the HR service providers. Okay, and keep in mind that by law we have to sign a minimum of a 1-year agreement. There's no choice around that. The advantages are just very simply fast market entry. You have a legal and HR team that's hiring these people. Payroll service is done. Employee onboarding is done. You're remaining compliant, so there's no leverage over you. And it's obviously cost savings in the long run should anything negative happen, right? So this is sort of like a diagram to show how it actually works. You've got the employer of record company, the client, the employee, and that's the relationship ultimately. So that's the end of today's discussion. There are 4 ways you can work with us if you're interested in terms of employment advisory, drafting employment agreements, handbooks, doing employee due diligences, employer of record services. If you want to reach out and contact me, I'm just going to add in the chat box my email address so you've got it. And then you can email me directly if you're looking to set up. And then let's ask the questions. So there are a couple of questions that have come in. Well, one specifically. What exactly is the difference between labor dispatch and PEO? So labor dispatch, the labor dispatch companies will only sign contracts with companies that already have entities in China. So the service agreement has to be between the labor dispatch company in China and your entity in China. And they will then, and that's why the entity in China is usually the representative office, not a limited liability company. Or if you're, for example, you're looking to hire part-time employees, you have to have an entity in China to be able to do that. Whereas with the PEO service, you're signing the service agreement with the overseas entity. So that is the difference between the two. The employer of record service or PEO company has the right to contract with the overseas company. The labor dispatch does not. That's actually the only question that's popped in. If you guys do have other questions, please do start putting them into the chat box. I'll stay on here to answer that. Hanwei has a question. Does a working shareholder need an employment contract? Only if you are, well, it depends, Hanwei. When you say working shareholder, where are you residing? If you're residing in China and you are a foreigner, you need to reside, in order to be able to reside there, you need a work permit and a residence visa. So you will need an employment contract. If they are Chinese, then they do not need an employment contract unless they're getting a salary. So if they are a shareholder and they are investing and they're going to get a salary from this company, they will need an employment contract. If no salary is going to be distributed to them, they do not need an employment contract. Victoria's question, do employees in the employer of record service belong to the company or the employer of record? They belong to the employer of record. So the service agreement is, there's a service agreement between the employer of record and the company. In the employment contract for the employee, every company does it a bit different. In ours, it will always state that that employee is working full-time for our client with these responsibilities. So at least in the contract, they feel like they're 100% working for that company. We do that also from a legal standpoint, that when the client terminates with us, we have the ability to terminate with the employee, because we say to the employee, they're terminating, they're exiting the market. And this is just from a paperwork standpoint. The discussions at the end of the day are not going to be like that. We're going to, we have to have a discussion with the employee saying the client is exiting the market. They don't see the potential. I mean, there's so much discussion that has to happen there first before the actual termination happens. But we are, as an employer of record, we are protecting ourselves from the paperwork standpoint to make sure that everything is legal. Victoria, I hope that answered your question. That's the only thing. These are the only, oh, a long one now. Okay. From John, 2 questions. Number 1, if mutual separation terms cannot be agreed and you need to go down a unilateral route, how often do these end in employee court disputes? Not often. Really depends on the termination and why you're terminating and what type of evidence you have. I'll give you a case right now of a client we've just recently had who's used the employer of record service. They had to terminate this employee because of misbehavior and the tone of voice she was using in communication, and just generally the collaborative aspect of the working relationship was not there. I was panicking because this employee is not easy. She's a force of nature, is what I have said. So I was worried. And again, it depends what approach you take. So what I wanted was that the client and the employee, we all sit in a Zoom call together. We explain the situation. And in the end of the day, with that discussion, which got heated on occasion, the outcome of that discussion was, yes, okay, I'm fine, but I want X, Y, I have certain demands, and the client was willing to give those demands. So it was okay. There have been situations, obviously, where employees have been taken to court. The issue that you have to think about, though, is what is the financial impact? You've got to know what the demands are, whether you can fulfill those demands. And if you can't fulfill those demands, what is the cost of going to court going to be against those demands? And make that decision. If you're a very large company and you can afford those court costs and the time and everything that's associated with it, by all means do it. If the demands are not costing you an arm and a leg, you may want to consider fulfilling those demands. So I think it depends. In terms of going to court, it really depended the situation on how much proof there was from the employer and how much proof there was from the employee to show that termination. So if the company doesn't have enough proof, they lost because the employee had more. If the company had more proof, then they won. So very, very difficult question. I'm sorry, I'm realizing how difficult that is. But it really comes down to the amount of proof, whether you're willing to pay those costs, what ultimately are the demands of the employee, and how you want to do that negotiation. I also want to say, it's not always that it goes to court. You might use a mediator first. So you have the option of fulfilling the demands, take the lawyer out, or you have the option of using a mediation tactic, and then going to court is the final. Question number C's. Do companies generally specify how the organization will manage salary increases? Oh, so how do you manage salary increases? Normally, when you hire somebody, the expectation from the employee is that after the first year, they will get a 10% increase. I don't know why that started or how that started. That is an expectation though. So you need to really bite that in the bud in the start of that relationship. I remember when we started our company in 03, 04, it was a requirement, not a requirement, but it was seen by your employees as something so negative if you didn't give that automatic 10% increase and just bit you in the bum, basically, in terms of your budget. So you definitely have to have that discussion upon that first negotiation. Then how do you do it? Everybody is a little bit different in terms of how they discuss the increases. How we do it, we base it on inflation. And we base it on the inflation of the city, not the country. So, and being in Shanghai is not the best for that, because obviously inflation is higher in places like Shanghai than it is in places like Wuxi, Wuhan, and tier 2, tier 3 cities. Although having said that, Tianjin has had recently the highest inflation rate because of the growth they're experiencing there. So you look at inflation, you look at your company's performance. Can you afford the inflation rate? Is the first thing. If you have the ability to afford the inflation rate, do it, because you'll avoid more discussions. You have to do it based on also the employee's performance. Have they been performing well? If it is somebody that you're trying to get kicked out, you might not give them the inflation rate, but below that, you might want to use the inflation rate as the base, saying if the person has performed at 100%, they'll get that. If not, then they'll get 80% of that. If they've outperformed, they'll get 120% of that. You might have a matrix system related to that. And it depends if you want to really have this matrix and this discussion. It depends on how big you're eventually going to be. How complicated you want to make your HR systems and protocols. But generally speaking, it's done by inflation in the city where you're located in and where those employees are based in. So if you have employees that are based outside, you would do the inflation on where they are residing. That's the norm. And I just want to highlight, because you said the word annual salary increases. Generally speaking, companies negotiate based on monthly salaries, not annual salaries. So when you are having those discussions, look at the monthly gross salary. That hits the candidates much better than if you start using annual salary terminology. Then comes bonus. So this is increase in salary, but then you also have bonuses, right? And you have to have a policy in place on what that is going to look like as well within you, right? So normally you set up 12-month contracts. You might say you've got a 13-month contract and that 13-month salary is a guaranteed bonus. Or you have a matrix system fulfilling bonuses. Completely up to you. You have the flexibility in terms of how you want to organize that. Then obviously, if you've got salespeople, you might have to negotiate commission rates. And what commissions are they going to earn on the sales that they achieve or the KPIs that they achieve? So a lot of components that you've got to sort of look at and see how you want to do it internally. It's your second question is also hard because there's no standard in China on that anymore. And a lot of things can be negotiated prior to a contract being signed. And you will also find that senior managers will automatically broach those subjects with you in the negotiation of their contracts. Like, do you get a 13, 14-month salary bonus? Or is it a matrix? Or is it based on KPIs? Or how is that done? They are more vocal about that right from the start of the negotiation. The more transparent you are from the beginning, the less issues you will develop, because what you don't want to happen is that you've never thought about these things. And then at the point that you've hit the end of year one and you're looking at salary increase, or you're looking at bonus or commissions or whatever the component might be, you don't want to be caught off guard and then say, oh my God, I don't want to lose this employee. He's done an amazing job. And you don't want to get into a situation where you have to give in to their demands. So broaching that and having a system in place on how you're going to organize that is critical from the start. This is something very difficult to do because you don't know how your business is going to grow. You don't know what you won't be profitable in the first few years. So how do you then pay bonuses and commissions? How do you motivate employees to stay with you if you can't afford that, right? So what I do, or normally what I recommend and what I've done when we started Woodburn back in the day was my first hires were senior managers. And I basically said, your salary will grow as the company grows. And we will have to evaluate, don't expect bonuses, don't expect commissions, don't expect any of this until I'm ready to provide it. Which is a tough thing to do and tough thing to then convince people to work for you. But everybody does it differently. There's always going to be a different way of having that negotiation. Will also depend on the qualification of the individual, what level they are at, etc. I could talk about this for hours, John, and I'm not really sure I'm answering your question. But I think, that's something I would do. I hope that's helped. There are no other questions that have popped in. If you guys do have questions, please, again, ask them. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes. Just to finish up, so tomorrow, what do we have tomorrow? Tomorrow, we're looking at work permits and residence visas, and I will be touching on using UK as a case study because the most people that are joining on these webinars are from the UK. And you can then use that as a takeaway to look in your own jurisdiction, what it might involve. So I'll be looking generally what it looks like to get work permits and residence visas in normal times, and what it looks like now, right now, if you are a UK passport holder residing in the UK. Then we're going to look at how to calculate personal income tax liability. And the biggest thing about personal income tax liability is the new legislation that's coming out in January next year and how that's going to impact foreigners, which is a disaster. We're going to look at social insurance obligations. And then on Friday, we're looking at recruiting your first employee for your China operation and what that would look like. Go to woodburnglobal.com/events if you want to sign up. Frank, thank you for joining on the public holiday. I appreciate that. No other questions have still come in. But remember, if you do sign up and you can't join, then you'll be able to look at the YouTube videos. We're not sending out the slides or anything like that. But if you do, Frank, if you do have questions specifically on calculations and formulas, then you can just also reach out to me on that once you've seen the webinar. All right, I'll leave you guys all there. Have a great day and a great afternoon, and hope to see you in the rest of the week. Take care and goodbye.